Today we are talking with Shawn Lawrence Otto, the author of The War on Science, who is waging it, why it matters, what we can do about it. Shawn is a very well-known science writer and science advocate, and we are delighted to have you with Rhetoric. Welcome to Rhetoric.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
The book that you have touches upon some of the most important issues for democracy, and as you talk about democracy's problem is science. Give us a little bit of context that how did you end up, or why did you write this book?
Well, I started out by noticing in 2007 that a lot of the conversation that the candidates for president were having really wasn't touching on big science-driven issues that are starting to affect voters' lives more and more. They were talking about economic policy, even though they were not economists. They were talking about foreign policy and military policy, even though they weren't generals or diplomats. And they were talking about faith and values, which was surprising to me, even though they were pastors or priests or clerics. But science and technology, which was really affecting all voters' lives, they were shying away from. So that was a very curious question to me. And a friend of mine, Matthew Chapman, who happens to be Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson, and I set up a website, along with a few others, Lawrence Krauss and Chris Mooney and Cheryl Kirschenbaum, called sciencedebate2008.com to encourage the candidates for president to really debate these big issues like healthcare and climate change and clean water and population, things that are large issues that are transforming society. And it went viral. We had this website soon had about 40,000 scientists and engineers and tech company CEOs and members of Congress and Nobel laureates that had signed on. And we had organized then with this strength a televised science debate. It was to happen on PBS, and we were doing it in cooperation with the television shows Nova and Now. David Brancaccio was going to moderate. But the candidates turned us down, and instead they chose to do a debate in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at Messiah College called the Compassion Forum on Faith and Values, where ironically they were asked about science questions, or about a third of the questions or so. So that brought up a very interesting point. What had transformed in American society where it had become more taboo to talk about science and technology than it was to talk about the traditionally more divisive topics of faith and values? And that's what led me down the road of exploring this change in our conversation.
As you point out in the book, there is no doubt that this century that we are living in could very well be called the century of science, but the voters are increasingly willing to reject science and to elect anti-scientific politicians.
Yes, it's a big problem, and I think that much of it is actually driven by the advances of science itself. A generation ago, you could sit down at your kitchen counter and you could make the latest science and technology by assembling the parts that you got from a Heath kit and put them together into a radio or even into a television. That wasn't beyond the reach of virtually anyone that wanted to take the time to do it. But today, if you take your cell phone and you turn it over, you notice there are no Phillips screws on the backside. It's not easy to take apart. And were it, the chances are it would not be something that you could make or even understand at your kitchen table. It's assembled with microchips largely by robots. So when science and technology become so advanced that they are beyond the easy accessibility, the sense of know-how, the accessible engineering of it, if you will, they become increasingly indistinguishable from magic. And at that point, they become vulnerable, and we become vulnerable to disinformation campaigns.
There's always a battle between science and money and people who have vested interest, and science is so central to our policy challenges. Maybe if you would draw us a little bit of historical context, that how over the last several thousand years that science has always been upending the traditional status quo, and only when people are forced to change, they eventually adopt the scientific change. So that will be helpful.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, what makes science so uniquely different and such a uniquely powerful force is that it takes nothing on faith. It says, show me the evidence, and then I will judge if what you say is true based on that evidence. And it has developed a system to remove assertions that something is true from the authority of the speaker and base them on demonstrable, step-by-step ties back to observations of nature that anyone can see and replicate with their own eyes, their own hands, and establish that something, yes, it is in fact true. And that is different from all other forms of human thought and has proved to be tremendously successful at transforming human society. But it is decidedly an anti-authoritarian point of view. So it constantly is creatively disruptive to established vested interests. I'll give you an example of, let's say, the big debate right now that has a lot of political traction around science in climate change versus the fossil fuel industry. Early advances into how fossil fuels worked and how we could find them in the geosciences and how we could utilize them to produce electricity or to transport ourselves or to produce heat, built up an enormous industry that powered humanity forward. But it did so without really understanding necessarily the full systemic consequences of broad adoption of that technology. Time goes on, science continues to advance, and new science begins to show, wait a minute, this is having some unintended consequences, atmospheric consequences, oceanic consequences. It could be, in fact, it could eventually change our climate, which was something that somebody predicted back in the 1850s. And so this new science disrupts this old vested interests, and a battle is set up. And this is what we're seeing going on right now in our politics. Science is never partisan in the sense that it is both conservative and liberal in that, and progressive. Scientists will always carefully, conservatively account for all the known information, the known values, if you will, that has gone before making a statement, or you can risk career suicide. But a scientist also has to be completely open to where the evidence leads into new ideas, or you risk career stagnation. So scientists are both conservative and progressive, but science is decidedly political while it's never partisan in that it is an anti-authoritarian perspective. And so it's constantly bucking authoritarian power structures, whether they are economic or ideological.
You point out in the book in a very nice, simple and pithy sentences there, as new developments and advances occur, we are facing a host of legacy challenges caused by commercialization of the incomplete scientific knowledge of the past.
That's right. And science always works in this way. As I said, it's creatively destructive because our knowledge is never complete. We can never see, that's kind of the whole idea of science. It's an acknowledgement that we can never see all of the universe at once. Knowledge is never complete, but as it becomes more advanced, we gain more and more understanding. And sometimes that understanding gives us a new perspective on how incomplete understandings of prior science may have some negative consequences that we want to now deal with from our superior perspective.
Let's go a little bit under the recent events, especially in the last 15, 20 years, and who is attacking science and how are they attacking, and on what front science is under attack?
Well, the attacks are really coming from three different fronts, I call them, in the war on science. The first really started becoming prominent about 50 years ago, although it had been prominent periodically throughout history, but it started gaining political prominence about 50 years ago, and that's the ideological war on science. That's largely driven by fundamentalist evangelicals and other very conservative religious types who object to what science says about human origins and reproduction. So issues around sexuality, around evolution, around birth control, around stem cell research, all of those things intrude, in their view, on what the Bible says or what the Quran says or what other religious texts say about human origins. And these people take a more literalist, authoritarian view of that. And so they've developed alternative approaches that are anti-science, in that they seek to deny what the evidence says and provide alternative explanations to achieve their predetermined conclusion about it, that the religious text was right. So we see alternative theories to evolution, like intelligent design, and movements to teach them in school. Or we see efforts to restrict control over the human reproductive cycle, or denial of sciences like, for instance, cosmology, that leads to the idea of the Big Bang. The second area really developed about 10 years earlier with the early understanding that chemicals in the environment that Rachel Carson brought to broad public awareness were starting to affect our ecosystems and perhaps human health, with the publication of Silent Spring. That really was, in many ways, it marked the birth of the environmental movement and the birth of systemic science and environmental science. This set up an existential challenge to certain companies' business models, and they responded by hiring public relations firms to develop arguments to cast doubt on the science. Because in this case, the science, what it was saying, was very strongly indicated, and the public had a great deal of respect for science because science was being used in the space race and the science race against the Soviet Union. So the American public in particular held a great deal of respect for science. So this public relations campaign had to attack not only the messenger, Rachel Carson, but the message, science itself. So they developed certain techniques around that were then adopted by the tobacco industry and later by the fossil fuel industry, and became a broad industrial strategy for casting doubt on science. And they all had to do with emphasizing the uncertainty of science, and that science is never settled, and that debate is a good thing, and thereby casting doubt on science and on the scientists. And we can go into greater depth on that, but first I want to get into the third aspect of the war on science, which ironically comes from liberal and progressive academics in the humanities, who really objected to the idea that science had any claim on objective truth. And they developed science studies and theories called postmodernism, where they argued that science was just one of many ways of knowing, and it had no greater or lesser claim on the truth than any other way of knowing, than, say, indigenous truth, or female truth, or male truth, or black truth, or LGBT truth. All these political identity groupings, that was really the source of one's authenticity and one's authority to speak on a topic, not objective claims from science. And this coincided very well with the civil rights movement, and it did some very good things in that it had the effect of empowering culturally and socially disempowered voices, which is strong for science, because the more perspectives we can bring to bear in a problem, the more likely we are to establish accurate evidence and account for all possible perspectives. But the idea that there is no such thing as objectivity was demonstrably false. The whole pursuit of objectivity, of tying knowledge to the object being measured instead of the subject doing the measurement, is what has driven all of scientific and technological advances. Science is a method for pulling what's known or knowable out of our political identity, or our gender identity, or our religious identity, or our sexual identity. So this notion that there is no such thing as objectivity was very corrosive to the anti-authoritarian ideas of science itself, and it became very problematic when it came to be taught in education programs and in journalism schools, to the point that for 2 generations now, journalists have been taught that there is no such thing as objectivity. And this has led to a large problem in our media called false balance, where journalists will portray information from a scientist on one side of the screen or in one half of the story and indicate that that is just that scientist's opinion. And they will put somebody with a differing opinion in the other half of the story or on the other half of the screen. And they will act as if those two opinions had equal weight, when in fact they do not. One is informed by all the known objective knowledge on a topic, and the other is just someone's opinion. And what this does is it winds up elevating extreme and authoritarian voices in our public dialogue, and it skews the public's ability to discern what's true further and further away from evidence. And we've seen this play out in our recent electoral discussion.
Absolutely. And this has been going on for years and years and decades and centuries. You mentioned very well in the book that anytime science contradicts scriptures, there's obviously a backlash. And most notably was Galileo example, if you want to kind of explain that as you bring it up in the book.
Sure, yeah. Well, and that's a very famous example. Because it contradicts scripture, it poses a challenge to power that is vested in that scripture. So in this case, Galileo, looking through a telescope of his own making, said that, looking through this and looking at Venus and looking at the moons of Jupiter, it's clear to me that the Earth is going around the sun and not the other way around. The Earth is not the center of the universe. And the Catholic Church very much disliked that public statement that he was making. And as a result, they indicted him, tried him, and imprisoned him under house arrest for the rest of his life, because what he was saying was posing a challenge to their authority. Now, the Catholic Church, several hundred years later, just recently, in fact, acknowledged that Galileo was in fact right.
And of the irony of the situation, Galileo was a religious person.
He was, absolutely. He was very close to the top religious clerics. And in fact, much of science emerged from religious explorations. It was true before the time of Galileo, during the Ottoman Empire and during the reign of Islam, when Islam was really the keeper of scientific knowledge and exploration. There was a man named Ibn al-Haytham who wrote a book called Optics that all the Renaissance scholars in Europe later studied, which is the first time we really know of someone clearly laying out what we now think of as a scientific method. And he eventually and his ilk were challenged by authoritarians, and science really collapsed in the Muslim world and emerged again after the Dark Ages during the Renaissance in Italy first, and then largely through the Puritan Protestants in England after the Catholic Church squelched scientific exploration by going after Galileo and other scientists. And it was really in England under the Protestants who then eventually sought ways to circumscribe the king's power and develop this anti-authoritarian method of thinking even more fully through the work of the lawyer and scientist Francis Bacon, and then left to come to the United States, that really laid the seeds for what became the modern scientific revolution.
So Protestant Reformation and the contributions by the Islamic keepers of science, as you mentioned in the book. So we have gone through this historically for years and years and decades and centuries. But the key issue going forward now for us, all of us, I believe, is that so much of the new science is likely to be advanced or understood or developed in the next 40 years. That could probably be more than what has been done since the recorded history of mankind. And as you say, we need the capacity to understand it.
That's right. Well, what it's posing is an existential challenge, really, to our ability to self-govern with democracy. Because, as Thomas Jefferson said, wherever the people are well-informed, they can be trusted with their own government. Benjamin Franklin was once asked, if you succeed, what form of government will this be? And he said, it will be a republic, if they can keep it. Both of them were mindful of this tension between the need for the informed public and the power of authoritarians, and they were trying to create a form of government that was separate and distinct and was based on knowledge and the people's ability to govern themselves with that knowledge. And the reason that this is being tested now is that because of the internet, scientists and engineers are no longer geographically constrained. The United States still has an educational advantage, but that is rapidly disappearing, particularly under certain immigration policies where we've become more restrictive and unwelcoming. Scientists and engineers are increasingly going, studying here perhaps, but going back to their countries of origin and establishing universities there that are world class. Even our universities, American universities, are establishing branches in other countries. The world is increasingly becoming globalized and interconnected over the internet, and scientists and engineers are collaborating over the internet, independent of geography, independent of time zones. So we have this phase change that's going on that's rapidly accelerating the quality of the science being done. And at the same time, we've educated so many more scientists than there ever have been in the past. So we've also seen a phase change in the quantity of science being done, to the point that now, when you do the numbers, in the last several years, we've actually created as much knowledge as we have in the previous 100 years. And over the next 40 years, we will have created as much new knowledge as we have in all of recorded history. And when you look at that and you think about the political implications that science has through its creative, destructive properties, the challenges that it poses to our cherished ideological views of the world, or to our existing economic structures, to our corporate presumptions about commercializing old science, you can begin to get a sense of the political upheavals that may pose if we don't find a more robust way of incorporating this advanced knowledge more successfully, strategically, and quickly into our policymaking process.
There is a link, a missing link, increasingly, between the creators of science, the developers of knowledge, and a general public who should be understanding it or benefiting from it. And that link used to be newspapers and magazines and traditional media. And as you point out, how that has changed in the last 10, 20 years, I would not take the stats, but you could, if you can explain how the coverage has completely decimated or disappeared.
Yes, well, largely this has been driven by economic changes in newspapers because of the internet and the free model of news on the internet that we're slowly starting to get away from, with people, publications starting to charge subscription fees for internet subscriptions, and people actually being willing to pay for it because they're starting to say, wait a minute, I do value real reporting versus just regurgitation or fake news. But this idea that science reporting isn't essential took hold under this extremely competitive economic environment, because science reporting was expensive and investigative reporting was expensive. And those two were the first areas that newspapers started to cut. And we went from a point where most newspapers had a science division to the point where just a few of them now have science sections, and the rest lump articles from, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times or the LA Times and a few other papers that still do original science reporting, and put them through syndication into a science and health section in the back of the newspaper. I've spoken to a number of editors and a number of news directors at television news shows, and they tell me that they don't think that the public is interested. And we actually decided to get some science on that and sponsored a poll, a National Harris poll, and found that, in fact, the public is largely interested in this, and that it's news directors and editors who are presuming that they're not, probably because they come out of the humanities and they didn't have a good experience in science themselves, and they think that the public isn't interested. But in fact, 85% of the public across party lines thinks that we ought to be talking more about these topics, and that candidates for high office ought to be well versed in them.
The false balance between objective knowledge and advocates has some serious repercussions down the line, as the empires after empires and regimes after regimes, because of the dumbing down of information, has led to the collapse of the societies. If you would kind of draw some historical context there.
Yes, well, this has happened over and over again as authoritarians have taken over in societies, or as the idea of objective knowledge has become devalued. It led to the downfall of the Roman Empire, when objective knowledge and original research came to be devalued and people just wound up kind of repeating the received wisdom. This happened again in China when China gave up its great innovative culture. For instance, they were the first creators of gunpowder and many, many other technological innovations that they were getting out of original research. And with the new regime, they began just becoming experts in process and production and lost their ability to have a creative class that did individual and independent original research. And they suffered economic decline. This happened in Italy again during the Renaissance, when the vast economic power that they were creating and amassing as the center of world culture because of this scientific explosion and artistic explosion that went along with it, and by the way, they do often and usually have to go together, moved on after the trial of Galileo and after attacks on other scientists. And Italy's economy never recovered. This happened in Nazi Germany. Hitler was an early adopter of science and technology. He was the first politician to fly around a country in an airplane, barnstorming, in a campaign called Hitler über Deutschland. And the Nazis actually created cheap radios called the Volksempfänger that people could widely access this new technology, but then they filled it with uniform ideology and patriotic music. And ultimately, even though Berlin was the center of world culture, world science, Einstein was there, several leading world artists were there. As the Nazis became more authoritarian, they left. They came to the United States, giving us essentially what became Hollywood on the cultural side. Many, many filmmakers came from Eastern Europe and Germany and France and formed really what became the modern American storytelling enterprise in Hollywood. And we got the benefit of their scientists, by and large as well, who came to the United States. And in the post-war society, the innovation that those immigrants brought really drove the American economic development. And their science and technology really are responsible for over half of the U.S. economic growth since World War II. But now, for the first time in the United States since then, we're seeing a rise of a new authoritarianism, and the media, as it has in all these other countries, beginning to equate science with opinion and to devalue the ideas of objective knowledge and to devalue the arts. And now we're seeing people talking about defunding science. Certain, for instance, even new people who are being considered for high-level cabinet positions in the government are questioning whether we really need certain original research being done. And that is a warning sign throughout world history. When cultures have done that, they've fallen from economic power because the engine seizes up.
And just to continue that thought, you bring it up in the book that why the engine seizes up is that lawmakers or the people who are in power, whether it's in the Congress or the Senate or in the cabinet positions, many of them just have a very different mindset from the scientists. A legal mind is different from a scientific mind. And if you could explain how are they different and what impact does it leave upon us?
Yeah, absolutely. They're very, very different. At this point, even though science is responsible for so much of our cultural change and our economic explosion of activity over the last 50 or 60 years, there is only one PhD scientist in Congress. And there are less than 2% of members of Congress that have any kind of professional background in science. Now, I'm not including doctors in that because many doctors are not evidence-based, as we've seen from certain members of Congress who were physicians in their prior career and are well-known science deniers. But the legal approach and lawyers very much dominate Congress. Compared to that less than 2% of people with a science background, 40% of Congress are lawyers. And the reason that's important is that lawyers take a very different approach. Their thinking is, We are going to research the heck out of an issue so we do understand both sides, because we want to be prepared for what our opponent may present. But then we're only going to present the side of an argument that supports our predetermined conclusion, or that convinces an impartial third party, be it the judge, the jury, or in the case of Congress, the body as a whole, that our argument is the most powerful and therefore the right one. And we're going to rely on an adversarial process and trust that our adversaries will make their best argument too, and the strongest argument will win. This is very different from science, however, which does not start with a predetermined conclusion at all. In fact, that's usually a very dangerous approach to science. Now, there are some deductive aspects of science, some posing of hypotheses, but one must always withhold judgment and go with what the evidence suggests. So a scientist is going to present arguments on both sides as fairly and even-handedly as they can, and then establish a conclusion that is transparently tied to what the overwhelming body of evidence seems to suggest. And in an age when so many major public policy decisions are heavily influenced by science, either because of the adoption of certain science and its environmental or cultural or health effects, or because science has profoundly critical information to shed on a public policy issue. The approach of science really needs to be much more a part of the conversation in Congress. The approach of an attorney is useful, but it leaves the conversation much more open to the influence of heavily moneyed vested interests who can make sometimes a much more emotionally compelling and persuasive argument that is not necessarily the one that is actually the most supported by the evidence.
The legal mind is focused more on winning the argument, and the scientists are more focused on establishing the truth.
That's right, exactly.
So what do we do as a common man with this massive disinformation campaigns that come from different sides? Yes, internet is information, but not everybody is educated enough to understand and separate the wheat from the chaff. What can we do?
Well, one of the most important things that I tell people to do is to really become vocal, not just with elected representatives, but it's important there, but also with reporters in the media. Demand better media coverage. False balance is not really fulfilling one's duty as a member of the press. The whole purpose of having a free press is to hold the powerful accountable to the evidence. That's the only reason that we have a free press. And in fact, that's always been the purpose of a free press, even in times of monarchy, is to question the powerful and hold them accountable to the evidence. And when journalists wash their hands of the evidence and instead say, well, since there's no such thing as objectivity, I'm just going to present both sides even-handedly and not take a position and let the readers or the audience decide for themselves, that is an abrogation of your job and your duty as a journalist. And journalists need to hear this from readers and from viewers over and over again so that they begin to realize that they have a fundamental and critical role to play as the tiller of democracy. And when they don't play that role, the ship of democracy begins to drift towards the shoals. So that's one thing that you can do, is contact those ombudsmen, write those letters to the editor, call the news stations. You know, I was on TV recently and I was talking to the reporter before the show, and he clearly understood what the evidence said about climate change. But when we were on the air, he acted as if it was an open question and that there was really a reasonable, legitimate controversy in the science community about this. And when we got off the air, I asked him about that, and he said, well, if I don't do that, I'm going to get tons of letters from our viewers, and station management is going to worry that they're going to lose economic support from advertisers. From my point of view, that's really an abdication of his job as a journalist. And we need to provide the back pressure on the other side of that so that journalist and journalists like him will hear that there are people who care passionately about being provided with real information and real evidence so that they can make real decisions in our democratic process. Another thing people can do is they can support nonprofits like sciencedebate.org. They can go there and sign up, add their name, and throw a little money that way, so that we encourage politicians to really debate these kinds of topics that are affecting voters' lives on television, on the radio, in public, so that the public can really get a sense of how well they really hold themselves accountable to the evidence versus how influenced they are by special interests in their thinking and in the way that they approach problems, and can take that into account when making an electoral decision. Another thing that people can do is actually support and subscribe to newspapers that are making an attempt to do this, like the New York Times. Pay that $15 a month online subscription fee. So that if you value that kind of journalism, pay for public radio if you value that independent kind of journalism. And support nonprofits like the Union of Concerned Scientists and their Center for Science and Democracy that are set up to really question politicians and policymakers based on the evidence. There are a number of other battle plans that I put forth in the book that those who have means or who have the ear of someone who could fund various university initiatives could have a profound effect on this conversation in our culture before it's too late. But that we could probably spend another 2 or 3 hours talking about those.
We've been speaking with Shawn Lawrence Otto, the author and the science advocate of The War on Science. Gripping and revealing book, no questions there. Tell us a little bit more about how did you get into this business of writing book and what attracted you to this specific topic?
Well, in organizing the first presidential science debate effort between Barack Obama and John McCain in 2008, it just became such a stark conversation amongst some of us that were working on that, how remarkable it was that politicians didn't want to talk about science issues. They thought it was a niche topic that no one was interested in. And journalists really didn't want to cover that, and thought also that few people were interested in it. And that struck me that something remarkable had changed in a time when science is driving so much of the public policy conversation, is impacting voters' lives so profoundly that the two of the major institutions involved in governance and public discourse, the media and politicians, weren't talking about it. And that seemed like it was very much worthy of a book and of exploration. And I began a series of conversations with journalists and with scientists and engineers and public policymakers to really understand what was happening and why this was happening. And it really led me down a path of understanding the very close relationship of science to democracy, and how science is really the world's greatest force for democracy, for freedom, and for civil rights that we've ever invented. And that story wasn't being told. It wasn't getting out there enough. And I decided that it was really a passion of mine and a mission of mine to get it more widely heard.
Thank you very much for your time and your comments. And we certainly would please keep us in mind if you are working on any other books that may come out on this or any other topic in the future.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me on, Manish.
Thank you. You're welcome.